English translation 569th contact. Thursday, the 1st of August, 2013. 10:14 hours.
You are already here. That is good. Because in the afternoon I have to build an H-stone wall together with Silvano, which has to be concreted on Saturday. Greetings, dear friend.
My greetings also to you, Edouard, my friend. Then I will come straight away to your request that that is Quetzal, I and our committee have discussed, and we have found that due to certain failures in our previous calculations concerning the group structure, some things in the statutes need to be reconsidered and changed. So we have found that some changes need to be made to Art. 44, because some facts of non-compliance have arisen with regard to the increase and completion of the core group of 49 as a result of various factors which had not been calculated in advance. As a result, the core group of 49 is currently still understaffed and therefore not complete, which now requires some amendments to the Articles of Association. This must be the case in order to ensure the correct quorum at general meetings as well as for other resolutions. For the same reason of understaffing of the core group of the 49, some rules have also to be changed which relate to the election of the board of directors, etc., and which have an impact on the future time. If you want to write everything down in the same way, then there are no intermediate questions. So the following important points have to be changed and reworded as follows.
Wait a minute, when Bernadette gave me Art 45, J.
That is correct. But this is an innovation which has already been regulated, but it is certainly necessary to repeat it because under J, also the presence of the core group 49 members has to be changed to 2/3. It will probably be good if you use the whole text of the innovation.
I do not have it yet, so I guess I will have to ask Bernadette. Just a moment. You heard that she will beam it to my computer in a few minutes. Then I can take it over directly.
Good, please give her my regards.
I will, but I guess it will take a while. You heard it yourself, she also greets you. Then I want to take out the innovation and copy it in. So that is done. Then I will change the obligation to be present to 2/3 and also take out the 42 members, because that seems to me not to be necessary.
So everything else is good so far. However, we have only dealt with what you have asked us to clarify and change. If you come across further points which might require a change due to the incorrect calculations on our part, we will of course also decide on them in further cases if necessary.
Then I think we have everything, or?
Yes, because we have not discussed other things, but only what Florina told me, just what I dictated to you. But what I still want to say, it should be up to you whether you want to disclose these matters of the statutes in the report of the conversation or not.
Good. Actually, there is nothing against it, but the group will decide on that. Then I would like to ask you for your opinion on 2 questions and answers I wrote for the March Bulletin number 83. I do not want to give the wrong answer. If you want to read the whole thing?
Of course, let me see.
Here you go.
Ta reads.
Reader's questions. Here I still have a question on the subject of thermal power stations, which were raised in the official contact conversations 519 and 521 by Patal and Billy. The drilling operations carried out in recent years have often triggered earthquakes. As the following press release of the 21st of July 2013 shows, Lake Constance region, geothermal drilling triggers earthquake. The earthquake near Lake Constance was not severe, but the consequences are still great. A geothermal project near the Swiss city of St. Gallen has been halted for the time by Baumgarten. Researchers see a connection between the drilling and the earth tremors, etc. Now the question, what would the operators of a thermal power plant have to pay particular attention to when drilling? Or where are geologically suitable locations for thermal power plants on Earth? excluding possible hazards from earthquakes, etc. Achim Wolf, Germany.
Answer. Thermal power plants that use heat from deep inside the Earth are geothermal power plants that are not typical of the Earth, which require large quantities of water to be heated by being fed into the Earth's interior and then transported back up again to use the heat from the water as a source of heat. This form of geothermal energy is mainly used for heating. For a number of years it has been possible to operate power stations in this way, which also generate electricity. This is why it is also said that such geothermal power plants produce electricity from the depths. So far, however, the development of geothermal energy in this way has been slower than hoped, which is why work is constantly being done to improve it so that the amount of electricity and heat produced can be multiplied in the coming years. The market has in fact developed much more slowly than expected, not least because of the very high initial costs and the many risks involved in deep drilling. Particular attention must be paid to the increasing risk of earthquakes caused by the injection of large quantities of water into the Earth's interior. Nevertheless, further projects for the generation of electricity and heat from geothermal energy are constantly being initiated. Experts say that by 2020, the capacity of deep geothermal power plants is expected to increase 40-fold to around 280 megawatts compared to the existing capacity of existing plants. This will generate 1.8 billion, 1,800 million kilowatt hours of electricity and 8.2 billion, 8,200 million kilowatt hours of heat annually. Other already existing plants tap into so-called aquifers or water-bearing layers at great depth. For example, salt water at a temperature of around 130 degrees Celsius is pumped to the Earth's surface through a borehole more than 3 kilometers deep, and after generating electricity and heat, it is cooled down again before being pumped back into the depths of the Earth through a second borehole. The whole thing is called deep hydrothermal geothermal energy. The technological challenge here is that the extracted heat is converted into electricity in a steam turbine. However, if the temperatures of the deep water are too low at certain locations where geothermal boreholes are drilled, an organic liquid with a low boiling point below 100 degrees Celsius is used to drive the steam turbine. A much more efficient heat transfer than evaporation is achieved by separating two mediums. This is done by using water and ammonia gas dissolved in it. Because this gas escapes from the water as the temperature rises and has also absorbed enough thermal energy at 130 degrees Celsius to drive a turbine. The ammonia is then absorbed back into the water. The whole thing is called the Kalina plant, named after the Russian-American inventor. Such plants are currently only used 3 times worldwide, as this is still a young technology that has not yet been extensively researched and will only prove its disadvantages and advantages over time. As far as the thermal power stations mentioned by the Plejaren are concerned, however, these are effective thermal power stations, which are operated by extracting heat from the Earth at great depths of 16 kilometers below the surface and pressing it down to the surface to transfer it to the appropriate power stations. These power stations are designed in such a way that they are operated directly by the heat extracted from the Earth itself, without the need for an additional medium, such as water or a chemical agent, etc. It is only the heat itself that is used, and I have no knowledge of the technology used in this respect. By means of such thermal power stations, the Plejaren produced the necessary energy, but at present, such power stations are only in operation in places or on worlds which do not yet have the modern Plejaren technology of today, which is based on the use of electrons, which are present everywhere in endless masses and by which all conceivable energy is created, although I am also unaware of the technology in this respect. For thermal power plants that do not simply use geothermal energy, but effectively very large amounts of heat from the Earth, It is also not necessary for water masses to be pumped into the Earth's interior during geothermal drilling, as is done for whatever reason during such drilling. Consequently, such measures of heat extraction, as practiced by the Plejaren, also do not cause earthquakes, as is often the case with geothermal drilling, in which large masses of water are pumped into the earth, causing earthquakes. Billy.
Question Billy. An acquaintance of mine recently told me that drinking water can now burn because human profit-making activities have trapped gases in it, which can be ignited by a small spark. Is that really true? E. Meyerhofer, Switzerland.
Answer yes, that is indeed the case. And the whole thing has its origins in so-called hydraulic fracturing, or fracking for short, as I know from a magazine in which I recently read something called Fracking Time Bomb. Fracking is a high-tech mining method for mechanical breaking of rock, in this case shale. Since 2008, it has been bringing unreachable natural gas to the Earth's surface, ushering in a new era of energy supply. It is worth noting that all the work of the Earthlings in terms of fracking is extremely dangerous and can cause great damage. It is a new way of generating energy, in the sense that fracking opens up previously inaccessible natural gas deposits embedded in vast shale deposits. However, the development of this shale gas is a deadly danger in the Earth's interior because the groundwater, and thus a lot of drinking water, is also contaminated by large quantities of methane gas released, and also by large quantities of fracking chemicals, which are added to the water-sand mixture, which is pumped into the depths to break up the shale rock and press the gas out of the deep rock layers, which is then extracted. The shale gas is not found in large cavities, as is the case with conventional extraction, but in the pores of the dense shale rock. The production process is by drilling a vertical borehole into the earth, drilling through the groundwater layer and then bending horizontally in the shale layer containing natural gas, after which more than 250 liters of fracking fluid is pressed into the shale layers at high pressure per second. This liquid is highly toxic and consists of water and sand and chemicals, which can be up to 12. The tremendous pressure of the fracking fluid causes thousands and thousands of cracks to form in the shale, opening the pores and allowing the gas to escape, which is then extracted. The sand contained in the fracking mixture prevents the cracks from closing again and the gas from being exploited. A single fracking operation requires between 10 and 50 million liters of water, with each well site being fractured up to 4 times. As dangerous as a water reservoir explosion can be, the mixture of chemicals itself is also dangerous. Oxidants and polymers support the flowability or viscosity of the fracking mixture, while various acids are used to prevent corrosion of the tools, and biocides are used elsewhere to combat bacterial growth. Of all these toxic chemicals, more than 40% remain in the Earth's interior as so-called flowbacks, which means that they gradually dissolve radioactive substances from the rock, which inevitably float back up again at some point and enter the groundwater. And this happens even though, after the fracking is finished, the borehole is sealed again with cement after about 55 to 60% of the toxic chemical source has been sucked out again. The cement closure is intended to prevent toxic substances and gas from entering the groundwater, which is illusory, because all these substances also rise up into the groundwater through all the layers above the slate layer. This, in addition to the fact that every third borehole is dangerously permeable, which means that the methane gas and chemicals can get into the groundwater and thus into drinking water. So the water is not only highly explosive, but also highly toxic for human beings and animals, and the plant world is also affected, dies or mutates. The methane gas and the chemicals inevitably end up in the groundwater, which in turn is often pumped up as drinking water into drinking water reservoirs, which may one day blow up if the highly concentrated gases in the water explode by some electrical or other spark. And if the human beings and animals drink this water, there is no doubt that they will fall ill and possibly also die from it. Billy.
What you have written as answers is correct, so no corrections need to be made.
Thanks. And there is also nothing important to mention that is still necessary?
Not in my opinion, because your answers are informative enough.
Here on Earth, scientists are working on building robots, from which androids may eventually emerge. As I know, real androids in the sense that you own them are only possible if Earthlings become capable of creating neuron brains, which are just an artificial bioorganic neuron network with high-speed conductors. Quantum electronics and quantum mechanics, etc., also play a decisive role in this process, whereby only from this an independence arises through an own learning as a result of an own intelligence. I only want to ask whether this is as correct as I say in memory of an explanation by your father Svath?
You remember it correctly, but our directives.
Of course, after all, I also have no intention of asking you for details, from which the Earthling scientists might derive benefit. The recollection just flashed through my memory, and so I wanted to know if it was correct. I will say, however, that back in the 1940s, when Svath explained a number of things to me, the Earthlings had still no clue of quantum physics, quantum electronics and quantum mechanics, just as they still have no clue today that the quantum physics is only a further step prior to others, which reach into much finer realms, which not until in the spirit energy physics finds the actual origin of all things and all being and being.
The way to this is still very long.
That is clear to me, but I have another question, which we also talked about earlier. Time and again, TV programs feature scientific or semi-scientific films that deal with research into the animal, mammalian, and wildlife world. These films usually deal with intelligence and learning on the one hand, as well as self-recognition or self-awareness of mammals and birds, etc. Questions and assumptions are always raised as to the extent to which, apart from the human being, the other earthly creatures are classified as having intelligence and thought processes, but this has not yet been clarified. This is precisely because the human being cannot communicate with animals and creatures in their languages. The human being needs only his own language possibility, whereby perhaps one or the other, who is closely involved with animals and creatures, is able to imitate their sounds, although it cannot be said whether these sounds say something correct or are really understood. Already your father Svath taught me in my childhood that all animals and all creatures, from the largest to the smallest, have their own means of communication, ranging from simple sounds, movements, vibrations, and their own physical behavior, etc., to certain effective phonetic understandings. You cannot say spoken language because there is no phonetic language. Svath said that this way of expression corresponds to a misunderstanding and chaotic judgment, because phonetic is only the orthography. Not a language because it is only done with words that are formed and expressed by the articulation organs larynx, mouth and tongue, etc. as certain articulation sounds. In this way of letter or syllable articulation, language is known only to the human being, whereas Svath simply spoke of the sounds that are peculiar to the animals, such as the dog's barking, the rooster's crowing, the goat's grumbling, the bird's whistling and chirping, the howler monkey's roar, the cricket's chirping, etc., etc. In addition, he taught me that all animals and creatures, depending on their genus or species, have a whole repertoire of different sounds, each representing a particular image, symbol, or even a particular syllable, so that mutual understanding is possible. Moreover, these sounds vary from region to region, so that one can speak of different sound dialects. But this is only possible because animals and creatures, depending on their genus or species, have a world of thought and instinctive intelligence appropriate to them, and even some higher mammals have an instinctive, semi-conscious world of thought and a corresponding intelligence.
What is said is correct, but I do not understand what you are asking.
Well, on the one hand, I do not understand why the earthly scientists have not yet come across these facts, since they should have found the truth long ago with their extensive experiments and investigations. On the other hand, I also do not understand why there is no explicit research in these directions.
There are several reasons for this. such as the fact that earthly scientists start from completely wrong assumptions, for example, by considering the entire animal and wildlife world as a life inferior to that of the human being. It is also a fact that scientists, like Earth humans in general, do not understand the vocalizations of animals and creatures, and therefore cannot communicate with them. Further, it is to be mentioned that as a rule, the majority of all scientists and Earth humans involved do not show any sympathy for the animals and the creatures, and therefore no connection can be established in this respect. If something is raised, it is only compassion, which is always wrong in any case, and which in turn leads to the false assumption that the animals and the creatures are simply animals and creatures that should be put on the same level as Earth humans. This is, of course, wrong when thinking about the evolution of consciousness and the treatment of the animals and the beast. Because on the one hand, an animal or beast instinct consciousness or instinct semi-consciousness cannot develop to the same extent as the conscious consciousness of the human being. On the other hand, the animals and the creatures cannot and must not be treated in the way that the human being is entitled to be treated. But the treatment of the whole world of animals and creatures must be carried out according to their genus and species. This means that every animal and creature must be cared for in accordance with its genus and species, and in such a way that its physical, mental, emotional, and psychological health and integrity are also taken care of. This, however, also requires of the human being an appropriate compassion for all animal and creatures for which he is responsible, for every animal and creature has a certain instinctive or instinctive half-conscious mind according to the genus and species, and consequently also a world of emotions and a psyche, which also determines the behavior. In this way, animals and all creatures are therefore very well able to judge by their thinking ability what is done to them for good or evil or what simply happens to them. So, in addition to physical pain and physical well-being, all animals and all creatures also feel instinctive, intellectual or instinctive, semi-conscious values such as joy, happiness, elation, lust, satisfaction, amazement, amusement, and pleasure, but on the other hand also unworthy values such as sorrow, distress, sadness, dullness, bitterness, and pain, as well as psychological agony and pain.
Your answer is enough for me, but I cannot understand why Earthlings often torture animals and creatures brutally until death. It is only to think of the animal transports, where the animals, usually mammals, are brutally mistreated in every conceivable way until they die screaming miserably in pain. It all comes back to me effectively and also reminds me of the Nazi concentration camps where more than 6 million human beings were tortured to death and raped by psychopaths. It also brings to mind the USSR, where millions of lives were destroyed, families disintegrated, and children were orphaned. Already since the mid-1930s, under Stalin's reign of terror, it had been completely commonplace that the human beings were picked up and executed by the Soviet secret police as a result of the smallest of offenses or on suspicion, and completely arbitrarily. Many also disappeared in the Gulag without the knowledge of their relatives. Millions of human beings were murdered or perished in misery. To my knowledge, there were 500 such concentration and labor camps in the Soviet system, which were already invented by Lenin, but which Stalin then developed into a perfect system. Nothing shaped the reign of terror in the Soviet Union as much as the Gulag penal camps. Perhaps it can only be explained by the fact that the Earthlings who do so have degenerated in their consciousness, thoughts, feelings, psychology, and reason in such a way that they are no longer able to distinguish between good and evil and right and wrong. This is a factor that is fundamentally peculiar to psychopaths, who appear in countless variations and spread an enormous amount of misery and evil. So Earthlings who mistreat and torture animals are just as depraved psychopathological, absolutely unscrupulous creatures who lack even the slightest glimmer of empathy. which is why they pursue their actions, behavior, and goals without any ifs and buts and know neither guilt nor remorse, so they are also not tormented by it. And what these psychopathological creatures, these very psychopaths, do to animals and the beast, they also do to the human being in one way or another at every opportunity.
You get to the point, so you understand how to judge the whole thing.
So be it. But then I want to ask you one more question, which we have also talked about before, namely about our and your sports. People keep asking me if you also do martial arts?
That is the case. But we practice martial arts in such a way that very few and harmless injuries of any kind can occur, so everything is harmless. If I compare our sports in this respect with the childish football and ice hockey sports that are practiced on Earth, then our martial arts are directly harmless against them.
We also have sports with balls, such as dodgeball, basketball, badminton, and volleyball, in addition to many other sports such as orienteering, gymnastics, and dexterity sports, etc.
We also know relatively safe ball games, as well as various others, but they are always such that there is little or no risk of injury.
What about extreme sports?
This is not usual with us because we do not consciously endanger life. Doing extreme sports is irresponsible and shows very strong forms of adrenaline addiction and pathological overestimation of oneself. Combined with foolhardiness, lack of conscience, and irresponsibility towards one's own life, possibly also towards other human beings.
That was it for questions, Ptah.
Good. Then I want to discuss 3 things with you, after which I will leave. If after I leave there are things that we have to decide about or that I alone can answer, then you can inform Florina or Injana, after which I will come here if necessary.